Hi. First, I want to thank our student musicians this evening, Rowan Jordhall and Eli Vorvik. You guys really set the mood for us all on the theremin and the waterphone. And welcome, everyone. My name is Avery Rage, and I'm a fourth-year biology major here at Luther. Thank you all for joining us today or tuning in on the live stream for Jeff VanderMeer, One Evening in Area X. We'll begin this evening with a land acknowledgement. The land on which Luther College stands has been home to the Iowa, Sac, Fox, and Dakota people and their ancestors. As part of the neutral ground created by the U.S. government to control the movement, lives, and livelihood of Native peoples, this land was home to the Ho-Chunk during their forced displacement from Wisconsin. The dispossession of the Iowa, Sac, Fox, and Dakota, and the forced migration of the Ho-Chunk people was motivated by the interests of settlers such as those who founded this town and this college. The Ho-Chunk, during their residence here, addressed the land as grandmother. The tribe's orator, Wakan Dakora, believed his people were extended the blessing of this place by the Great Spirit, saying, "We did not make it, nor could we make it, so pretty and fair a land." Please honor this history and the ongoing connection of the descendants of these early residents to this place. Please also honor and care for the land, water, and resources as these residents have, like a loved and loving elder to whom we owe our life. We are very excited to have Jeff VanderMeer here at Luther. He is a distinguished author, most well known for his fiction works such as Hummingbird Salamander, the Bourne Trilogy, and the Southern Reach series. Beyond his award-winning work as a fiction writer, VanderMeer has a distinct passion for conservation and our environment. His essays on environmental issues have been featured in notable publications such as Time, The Nation, Current Affairs, and Esquire. Additionally, he founded the Sunshine State Biodiversity Group, a nonprofit organization dedicated to conservation and education about biodiversity and rewilding in Florida. Andy Hageman will be in conversation with Jeff VanderMeer this evening. Andy is a professor of English here at Luther, and he also serves as the director for the Center of Ethics and Public Engagement, what we call the KEEP. I'm personally very thrilled to be here, and I hope you all are too. 4 years ago, I took weird readings from Andy during J-term, and easily one of my favorite texts from that class was Annihilation by Jeff VanderMeer. The world of Area X was greatly inspiring to me, and the ideas the book explores have always stuck with me as I continue to study biology and working towards being a researcher myself. As we continue to chart into unprecedented times, particularly concerning the climate and environment, VanderMeer's work feels more poignant than ever, if not to offer comfort in the fact that we, like the scientists studying Area X, don't always know what's happening, then to inspire change in us all, and to recognize this unknown and strive to keep asking questions and doing the important work anyway. Now, enough from me. Please join me in giving Jeff VanderMeer a warm Luther welcome.
Thank you, Avery, for that lovely introduction. Thanks, Eli and Rowan, for the musical mood setting. Thanks to everyone for coming out and on the live stream. So folks near and far who've read Jeff's work or are about to get excited about reading it. And thanks to Jeff for coming to this oddball spot of Decorah.
The driftless, I understand.
Yes, you've only heard that 18 times today about the driftless. All right. Well, to kick us off, I'd like to hear, Jeff, a little about the origins of your relationship with fiction or literature more broadly. And what I'd like to ask is maybe one or two memories from your tweens or teens when you read something and it just kind of shattered your worldview or really changed your perspective on particular issues.
Yeah, well, I was very lucky to have parents who liked to read to me and give me texts that I didn't quite understand that were usually above my reading level. And there's something about a text being mysterious in some ways that makes you kind of fill in the gaps. So you begin to become a writer for that reason. So they used to read William Blake to me as a young child. And I grew up in Fiji, so the seminal texts that I had there were Asterix and Tintin comics. And then these amazing comic book versions of Indian, Hindu, and Buddhist myths and stories, like the Ramayana, that were directly printed in India and then available in Fiji. I still have 43 of them. In fact, when that Life of Pi movie was being made, I was contacted by one of the production people about getting those comics to put in the back of one of the scenes, because they're actually pretty well known in India from that time period. So I had a lot of stuff like that, along with like a lot of texts about talking hedgehogs, because we had a lot of the British books. And then I would say that as a tween, as you put it, I was given Lord of the Rings way before I could read it properly, and so that was also very mysterious to me in a good way. And then I would say that the time that the top of my head was really blown off was reading Angela Carter in high school, because I was struggling with, like, I had this propensity for a certain type of language and a certain approach to language, and it was akin to poetry because I started out as a poet, but I couldn't find any kind of analogous text in fiction. And my creative writing teacher, Denise Standiford, my junior year, handed me Angela Carter's Bloody Chamber and said, "Here, this is what you're trying to do." And I didn't know you could do that with language in novels. And so that really helped kind of steer and orient me, along with reading a ton of science fiction, a ton of stuff like Nabokov, a little-known writer named Edward Whittemore, who used to be a CIA station chief in the Middle East and wrote a book called Jerusalem Poker that's kind of a magic realist take on spy fiction. And yeah, so things like that are really the seminal moments.
Right. Yeah, you'll need to get your Goodreads accounts open. And every conversation with Jeff includes like 5 things that you put on your to-read list right away. Well, we're kind of getting there, maybe with the Angela Carter, but I wanted to hear too, a question I hear people ask film directors a lot is, what was an early film where you realized there was a director behind it? There's somebody sort of doing some formal things that are affecting the way that it impacts you. And I wonder, maybe for literature, and you can go to film too if you want to, but for literature, besides Angela Carter, what were some early books where you really thought, oh, there are writers really doing interesting things here?
Imagining Argentina by Lawrence Thornton, because it used some interesting things, like including lines from plays in the books in interesting ways. And I think it's Patrick Suskind's Perfume, which also did some interesting things with style. And then also, honestly, Nabokov, because his books are so different from one another that it was really inspiring to me, whereas Angela Carter used basically the same style throughout. He molded himself to the material so much that I was like, I want to do that. I want to be someone where if they didn't know what the name was on the book, or the themes were similar, they would assume it was a totally different writer who wrote it. I want to have that kind of range. And so when you talk about what you're talking about, what I used to do is I would take books that I had really enjoyed or that were challenging, and I would rewrite chapters from memory and then compare them to the original to see. And usually they were terrible, obviously, right? But every once in a while, there's 1 or 2 things where I thought, I did something different, not worse, but different, and that's what I do well. And then sometimes I would actually inhabit the text, like Ulysses I could never make head or tails of, so I sat down one day and I just tore the book in half, and I tore some chapters out, and then I proceeded to type them up, like right off the thing. And that's a way of inhabiting the text in a way. Like for me, when I write a scene, I'm inhabiting that scene as I type it. Like there is no outer world. I'm actually in that scene. And so that helped me understand the book better. And I did that with a lot of texts.
Yeah, great writer's tips tonight for folks. So from the individual, those couple stories, I wonder if we could move up to social levels and sort of how do you envision the roles that literature plays in society? And I think, if you want to speak generally, that's great. And if there's anything about maybe the last 5 years, I mean, we've been through COVID. We're in a space now since January where things are different. So if you want to tie it to a time, or if you just want to talk in more general terms, up to you.
I'll address the general first, and then maybe you'll nudge me about the specific if I forget that part. Weirdly enough, like I grew up thinking that someone who wrote was a person of letters, which is to say that they were part of a wider community, that they were involved in literary events, that they would write nonfiction, that they would help their fellow writers in some way. So I didn't really see fiction writing as a separate, like, individual hermit thing. I saw it immediately as being communal in some sense, and that you were part of this wider world that you had a responsibility to. And so that's what I did. I wrote a lot of nonfiction as well. I started a publishing company in my teens, and then also published a literary magazine. I did events out of Gainesville, Florida, at the Thomasville Center. So kind of immersing yourself in a wider literary community. At that time, it was not really linked to the environment, environmental science, ecology, things like that. It was strictly straight up, just about the fiction. So.
Yeah, and I feel like we see headlines sometimes that say, "Can a poem save the world?" And so I just wonder what do you think? Not necessarily specific just to your fiction, but how, what roles do you think it plays in shaping the social imaginary?
I think it's a difficult question to answer because there's so many different answers. First of all, I'm skeptical of the direct effect of fiction. I'm very skeptical about using novels, for example, as the blueprint for policy, even novels that purport to be hard science fiction, because often there are huge gaps, interdisciplinary gaps in those solutions and those books and simplifications. So I sometimes say that I want my policy written, based on science and logic and what works for government, not, some idea that someone's pulling out of a science fiction novel, no matter how plausible it seems. That's not what I read fiction for. What I read fiction for is to be immersed in the moment. And I think what fiction can give you about this moment is the psychological truth of something. So, for example, some people consider my novel Born about a giant flying bear in a post-apocalyptic city where people are scavenging for food as being fantastical. But in actual fact, the circumstances that the people who are scavenging exist in some cities today, right? It's just that if you haven't experienced them yourself, because this reality is unevenly distributed, then you may consider it more fantastical or out there than it actually is. Even a flying bear on the horizon, the lurch it gives you in your stomach might be similar to the lurch that someone feels when they see a militia approaching their city, or something unexpected out of the horizon that seems surreal at first. It seems like it can't be real, it can't be happening to me. And so I think that's something that has nothing to do with extrapolation. I'm very wary of extrapolation in fiction. I'm very wary of topicality, because both things seem to be limiting as to what fiction's supposed to do. But I do think that you can do that, and you can, by trying to portray some kind of truth and making sure that the science or whatever is the bedrock of something isn't junk science or whatever. I think you can make a difference. And for me personally, it's about the non-human perspective, because in so many novels, I'll see someone who obviously has studied quantum physics, but they have animals in some major way in their work, but they haven't looked at animal behavior science in the last 20 years, so it's like reading a Disney movie in print. It's not realistic, and the other stuff is. And so if you know that stuff, it's kind of jarring, and it's also a missed opportunity to tell the truth about the world.
Could we go to COVID time? And I mean, in part, I'm just a student of, and I think many of us are students of, how it affected people personally, but also professionally. And it's always fascinating to hear, how as a writer, maybe both just in your own sort of work practices and life practices, and how you think it, I don't know, a few years on, how it may have shaped things, even indirectly or unconsciously.
Well, I mean, one thing as a writer, and I think in any field it's true no matter what you go into, at a certain point you have to forgive yourself for not being able to do the thing because the outer world's impinging on you in some way. So there was a large period of COVID where I didn't write at all. And you recognize that some paradigm about the world has shifted. And it's not even necessarily about the thing itself, but about people's reaction to it, which of course is where a novelist's work lives anyway. So you also don't want to write too soon about something, or you want to kind of absorb it before you do. And I also had the weird and slightly unpleasant experience of publishing Hummingbird Salamander into the heart, one of my novels, into the heart of COVID, and having it, have the pandemic in it. Like I had the wherewithal for the backdrop to continue editing it right up until publication almost. And so I was able to get very close to the point that people were at when they read it. And you learn very quickly whether people in that circumstance want escapism or they want something that's like what they're seeing outside their window. And I wasn't sure I wanted that either. So yeah, it's I think it's changed people's work habits. It's literally changed the publishing company who publishes my work in terms of their dynamic, because half of them no longer come into the office at all. Like their graphic design department just flat out said, we're never coming back to the office. If you want our brilliance, we're going to stay off-site. I just think psychologically, it's rendered the visible what has been invisible, right? Like we're all surrounded by microbes and all kinds of things that make a mockery of inside and outside of our bodies. Like if we were really able to see all of this, we would see how we kind of flow into the world and flow out. And I don't mean that in kind of a mystical way, I mean a literal scientific way. And so I think in some ways, COVID has laid things bare. And of course the result is that some people have decided to create their own fiction about it to avoid coping with it sometimes, or for whatever other reason. So it's a broad question you're asking, because for a novelist, you may actually deal with something a decade after. But what I will say is that after this period of not writing, I felt an urgency to write. And so one reason that Absolution only took 6 months to write is I think that I had not written for so long that it was bottled up in me. So.
Great. Well, we're already getting towards, bound up in your answer was kind of transdisciplinarity there, and we are at a liberal arts college. Jeff did a great job with several students doing a campus walk today and at lunch, and we were really noticing we had students from bio majors, anthropology majors, statistics majors. So I'd love to just hear from you about how you see interdisciplinary ways of knowing as important to society, if not essential.
Well, you often see scientists today struggling how to convey stories, or what's the narrative of climate crisis? How do they convey information in a way that connects with people? And I think very much about how, like in Victorian times, often a scientist would convey their findings at the podium in the form of a poem, or the philosophical tale where the thesis would be conveyed as a dream journey into some fantastical place much earlier. And so there was a time when there was much less of a wall between what you might think of as the creative arts and the scientific arts. And similarly, I think we're seeing that we reach kind of a peak of scientists being siloed themselves in their specialties, and more of a recognition that communication and everything else, and also being a generalist, is extremely helpful in dealing with something as complex as climate crisis. Even on a small level not involving climate crisis, one of my dad's biggest discoveries, he's a fire ant scientist. He runs the USDA lab in Gainesville, Florida, for fire ant research. He was just like drunk at a bar with a guy who studied poison dart frogs, two people who would never have encountered each other, but they happened to have a fire ant conference and a poison dart frog conference in the same Melbourne hotel. And he learned that this guy had like all these frozen poison dart frogs in his freezer, and that he had collected these particular ones because they seemed to be immune to fire ants. And so he wound up isolating an enzyme produced by these poison dart frogs that repelled fire ants based off of this one thing. And it was a natural deterrent that involved no chemicals. And the whole process would not have happened if he had never wound up in that bar. He never would have discovered this thing. That's an extreme example. That's not how I think scientists should operate, although I do understand large amounts of alcohol are often involved. But yeah, I think it's very important.
Yeah, wow, that's a great chance encounter. So Jeff is really well known in that sort of parasocial way. People who don't know you through social media posting, and Jeff posts a lot about birds in particular. And any student who's had my class knows that icebreakers on day one are share your bird story. So I thought it would be appropriate to ask you maybe to share a bird story or two, maybe a really recent one and maybe an early childhood one, and just talk about sort of how do birds play into the good life for you.
I'll use a good and a bad example because they're both instructional for fiction. When I was a child, I had asthma and a lot of allergies, and I grew up in Fiji because my parents were in the Peace Corps, but they, and it was beautiful, but I also had these problems where I would wake up some days and I couldn't open my eyes, basically, and I couldn't breathe properly. And for some reason, in traveling back to the U.S., my parents decided to take us to Cusco, which is, at altitude in Peru, and they wound up having to put me on an oxygen tank, and it was a very surreal time in general because I was in kind of an altered state. I felt very weakened. I could feel my body kind of creaking, and I had this absolutely just mind-blowing experience where our hotel was up against the side of a hillside or a mountain, and it was there was a window, and literally the way it was, there was just a triangle of moss and air right outside the window, and it was the side of the mountain. And my parents went off to do something, maybe get me more oxygen, I don't know. And these two absolutely beautiful emerald hummingbirds just started a courtship dance right in that mossy space. And to my mind, it was miraculous because I was in this altered state. I was probably on some kind of drug or something. And it just seemed like something out of nowhere. It seemed like it wasn't real. And it was made less real by the fact that they were gone by the time my parents came back into the room. And I remember crying at the time because I was in a lot of pain. And seeing this thing that was so beautiful, it even still affects me now. And so that's one reason hummingbirds appear a lot in my fiction. Fast forward to Ithaca, Cornell, just a few years ago, and participating in a Sowit owl banding, and realizing halfway through that the retired ornithologist doing it was kind of ritualistically banding, and we were there as volunteers, but basically there was no purpose to the banding. And realizing this only halfway through, so you're kind of stuck in the ritual yourself. You're watching a saw-it owl in someone's hand, having a syringe put in it to draw blood to check for parasites, and it looks like nothing more or less than alien abduction with the owl staring up at the person. Things get more surreal because the neighbor, the nets are in disrepair, the owls are all entangled, it takes hours to get them out. The neighbor is sick of hearing the fake owl sounds you have to use to get the Sowit owls to come, and so he calls it in as a meth lab. You're there when this giant cop unaccordions himself from this small cruiser, and you get to see this small volunteer holding out a Sowit owl to the cop who's bending over to see it, to assuage him of the idea that we're a meth lab. And the cop very gently, touching the top of the owl's head, giving a thumbs up and leaving, which was nice. But then you decide, I don't want any more part of this. But there's bad lighting outside, and you stumble outside, and you've been in the light, and now you're in the dark, and you can't adjust to it. Just as the guy who called in the meth lab just roars in his muscle car. So you fling yourself into the ditch. You hear him shouting at the guys inside, and you're like, should I help them? And you're like, no. And you crawl through the ditch because you can't see yet, but you want to get out of there. And you make it to your vehicle, and you think one more time, should I go help them? No. They were fine. And because it's the middle of winter, and you're 40 minutes away, you take this godforsaken rural road that you can only go 20 miles an hour at, or you're going to hit an animal, or you're going to have black ice problems. And you text your wife, but your hand's kind of trembling. You're outside the road, and you say, very misspelled, caught an owl, cops came. And then you try to type it over again, but you cut and paste, so you just tape the same gibberish over again. and your wife posted on Facebook saying, "I don't know what's happening to my husband," and that was my other seminal owl bird experience.
Wow, I don't know where you get from that to the southern reach at all.
Well, that scene kind of appears in Dead Astronauts, in a way, from the perspective of this fox gone rogue who doesn't like humans very much.
All right. Well, while we're
Have I rendered you speechless?
Yeah. What's the segue?
Be careful what question you ask next. You don't know what answer.
Well, segue or no segue, I thought we'd go to Absolution next, which is Jeff's most recent novel, published in October, and it's book 4. So the trilogy came out of the Southern Reach series, and I just wonder, what was it like having that trilogy, and what was your process of going back and sort of re-entering that world that you had created? I know for many of the people here, especially students, but also lots of staff and faculty colleagues, have read Annihilation, at least, and Area X is a place that lives inside of everyone who's read it. And I wonder for you, what was it like to go back inside that world that you created? What did that look like to get sort of ready for and then jump into book 4?
Well, first I studied all the Reddits with their theories about what was happening in the series, and I stole mercilessly. No, I'm kidding. I studied the movie, and then I stole mercilessly. No, I'm kidding. Actually, before I started writing Absolution, I had this nightmare because in the clause with Paramount about the movie, I had the first right of refusal to write the novelization of the movie. And so I would have this recurring nightmare that I had lost all my money and I had like a cardboard sign and was like writing stories for pennies. And I suddenly had to write the novelization of the movie. Well, I had written a story called The Bird Watchers, which had the kernel of Absolution back in 2017. And and stop me if this goes on too long. I taught at Clarion Workshop, and I always put out for the students one of my own works and ask them to mark it up so they can see that, critique is not personal. And in this one case, one student was the only student who dared to do that because all the other students thought it was a trap. And she marked it up completely with a red pen, and she circled 2 sentences. And she sat me down and she said, "Jeff, this is all wrong. Your readers don't want any of this. These 2 sentences work. Toss the rest." And I admired the gumption. I really did. Like, I thought that was amazing. I really thought that was brilliant. That student turned out to be Kristen Rupenian, who wrote Cat Person, which was then made into a movie. But that, she was right. So I let it percolate and simmer for a while. And then when I sat down to write it, of course, there had been almost a decade of affirmation, right? Of posting about it, joking about it online, and readers engaging in imaginative play, being willing to accept the ambiguity and to run with it, right? So I felt very confident that I could just go for it, which is why there's passive-aggressive cannibalism in the novel and other things that are fairly transgressive, because I just was like, I can just go as weird as I need to for this novel. It's the 4th in the series. They've already rewarded me. They want this uncanny stuff. So I felt no pressure at all. I just felt like this is great, to the point where I actually posted excerpts while I was writing it on Twitter, and people would respond to it, but like in a very respectful way, because sometimes that can go really badly and you have to delete it, otherwise it gets in your head. But yeah, it just kind of welled up like a storm on July 31st. I had the whole structure in my head. I've never experienced anything like it. And by December 31st, I had a 140,000 word novel, which meant I'd written over 350,000 words, including all the drafts. And I just wrote morning, noon, and night. It was exhausting. I was so exhausted that I couldn't do anything else, and I couldn't do anything after I wrote it except sleep. So it was a really transformative experience.
Passive-aggressive cannibalism. That's the only kind of cannibalism that the Midwest is sort of okay with.
Well, I mean, I joke about it because, of course, there's two types of cannibalism. I don't know that I should really get into this, especially with the live stream, but there's active cannibalism, which is bad. That's murder. Okay, just don't do that. There's passive cannibalism, which is like when your plane crashes and your friend's like, yeah, you can eat me if I die, until they rescue us, and and that's okay. It's not great. You're not going to enjoy that scenario, but it's not a crime as far as I'm aware. And then there's the passive-aggressive cannibalism that's in my novel.
All right. I feel like we fulfilled our Center for Ethics sort of moment there.
Well, I mean, the thing that's funniest about that to me is that third section of the novel, just so you know if you haven't read it, is full of F-bombs, 1,225 F-bombs, because the main character is under the influence of these experimental anti-anxiety drugs that make him use the F-bomb in his thoughts and in his speech. And so I thought it was hilarious, frankly. Like, there's so many permutations of the F word that you've never seen before. But the reader response has been quite interesting, because I've never seen so many 4-star Goodreads reviews that take off 1 star for swearing, but have no mention of the rampant cannibalism, the people who disappear into liquid, and all the other things that happen in that section. So I totally misjudged what the reaction would be to it. I mean, a lot of people have responded to the humor, but sometimes as an author, you have no idea. And of course, then you go to Glasgow for an event where they use the F-bomb as punctuation, and they're like, there were F-bombs in that section? I didn't even notice.
All right, well, I have one more question for Jeff, and then he's going to read a passage, and then we're going to open it up to audience Q&A. So my last question for you is, on this Earth Day, where do you find hope? If you do. I don't want to presume that you do. If it's going to go dark, it goes dark. But if you do, where does that hope reside?
Well, I mean, personally, I know if I stopped writing that there would be a problem. I think writing itself is an indication that I have hope. I guess I have hope in the facts, because the facts are where the solutions lie. So the one thing I say is that, it's important to not to quantify what you mean by hope, because it's important to have the facts at our disposal no matter how grim they are, and not do the things that are not based on fact that we think are useful but aren't. Because that's a form of fantasy. So, no matter how grim the facts are, no matter how grim it is in terms of the percentages on the solutions, that's where the hope lives, because that's the only place that allows us to dig out from under this. Anything else is just BS, I mean, it's not useful. Whether it's like you plant 1 million trees or something and like all of them die in 4 years because no one had a follow-up plan or something like that. I think also, it gives me hope that my stepdaughter, Erin, works for a sustainability company in the Netherlands that's doing work for like Singapore and a lot of cities in the US, and she still has a lot of hope, and she has more facts and figures at her disposal than I do. So those are kind of my barometers. And then also the fact that, I do meet so many young people who are so engaged. And you talk about effects, like I can't gauge what effect the books have on people, but I do know that, at almost every event, almost every week, someone emails or tells me, I got into environmental science in part because I read Annihilation. That's something I wouldn't have expected. The cynic in me would disavow that it's a real thing, but it is a real thing, so it's kind of more of an indirect effect. You helped someone in a certain way, a little bit at least, to kind of move towards a path that's helpful.
All right, great. Well, on to the reading, and yeah, then when we move post-reading, we'll move to the Q&A, and when we do Q&A, Jeff will call on you, so just pop a hand up. Jeff will call on you. Enunciate really loudly, and then Jeff has agreed to repeat questions, so it'll go out to the live stream and everybody in the room can hear it really well, right? Okay.
So Absolution is split into 3 parts, and for those of you who don't know, the whole series is about the exploration of this strange forbidden zone on the coast of what probably is Florida, where this invisible border has come down, and inside strange things are happening, and they keep sending expeditions in. And strange and bad things keep happening to the expeditions. I'm not going to read from the 3rd part. because I don't trust any of y'all with your phones and the F-bomb. And I'm not going to read from the second part, which is kind of exploration of Area X right before it forms, but I am going to read from an expedition of biologists that occurs 20 years before the events that make Area X happen, but is very influential on how that takes place. And so the novel kind of like connects the dots on these three sections to give you a complete story. So these biologists, funded by the government and kind of experimented on without their knowledge by a secret agency, come to the Forgotten Coast, which these books are set in, and they begin to take samples and things like that. And so I'm going to read from early on in the novel, part 5, The Visitation. And I think the only other thing you need to know is that Drunk Boat is the nickname for the local poet. Some of you may get that reference. And Man Boy Slim is his friend. For dead people, or the deads as they began to be called in the village bar, the biologists stopped often in their labors that summer to curse about the heat and humidity, which when overheard surprised the locals because it was such a human thing to do. That drunk boat at night in the distance, while up to unspecified activities, could sometimes see the bobbing headlamps of the biologists well out to sea, so to speak, mystified him as much as if fairy lights had swept down low above the marshes. Perhaps to create a distraction from the conditions, the biologists had accelerated their tagging of so many living things and the hours across which they spread such endeavors. A vast human migration across the face of the earth, the drunk boat said, downing a shot. For the moment, the bar's sole authority, Man Boy Slim having gone into Bleekersville to fix his car, unnatural and without relief. No one disagreed, for the scope had expanded almost without a will in place to drive it. The biologists cast nets for tiny fish in the shallows. They set net traps for small woodland creatures. They took fine nylon nets and created capture zones for songbirds, often running aghast to the rescue of what they themselves had endangered. For a songbird was a terrible curse, unpredictable and angry and easy to harm. At the zenith of their powers that July, the biologists' boot prints outnumbered the tracks of deer and raccoons on the mud flats. The blue caps from tranq darts became a common sight alongside empty beer cans and shotgun shells. The sun shone at their backs, and the sea wind was in their faces, and their bodies glistened with sweat, with the nights full of laughter and good cheer at the end of a hard day's work, or with the work just beginning. Their labor was a rhythm, and their labor was a pact, and their labor continued unbroken. It would have been mid-July when the first anomaly occurred, almost a month before the luck of the biologists could be said to have worsened exponentially. A biologist taking samples on the mud flats in front of the wildflower meadow encountered the rabbit first. She had been chosen for the mud work because her slight frame protected her from being mired up to her knees, but also she had a rare knack for navigating that landscape, far greater than anyone else on the expedition. Watching her spindly form from afar, Team Leader 2 would marvel at, quote, how she manages to seem like an insect, using the tensile pressure of the water's surface to glide across, well, in this case, the mud. Old Jim, reading this account back at Central, flagged her as the mudder in the files, a shorthand he employed now from habit, when he had an interest in a person. Besides, they should have called her that. Intent on begging mud into one last vial and placing it in her backpack, the mudder started at an unexpected crunching sound to her left, just out of her peripheral vision, pivoted on her haunches, and fell on her ass when she saw the source. A large white rabbit with bloodshot eyes calmly ate a fiddler crab, crunching on the carapace, gulping it down, and starting on another. The rabbit had a starved look about it, a gauntness under the tangled fur splashed brown. The matter-of-fact way the rabbit ate the crab unnerved her, the mudder wrote in her journal, as much as the presence of the rabbit itself. Ragged pink ears edged with matted white fur twitched in multi-directional ways as if receiving data from radio waves. The eyes focused on me with what I can only call indifference or even contempt, the mudder wrote, but then changed her mind. The rabbit stared through me, as if its eyes could not focus, or it was intent on some sight behind me. No, that's not right either. I just know it was not natural. This page was water damaged along the left-hand side, so old Jim could see that another sentence read either both so still and in constant motion or but so still in its consistent motion, the rest of her reaction lost. Trying to right herself, the mutter instead wound up on all fours facing the rabbit, while the rabbit continued to eat crabs alive. The rabbit might first crush the crab's carapace with one solid paw before feasting, the soft insides pushing out from the shell, or just crack it with its teeth. While the crabs let the rabbit devour them as if mesmerized, as if the rabbit registered as an inanimate object that just happened to be killing them. The pink workings of the rabbit's mouth as it crunched crabs to death, the inner hint of rows of sharper teeth than she would have expected, sent her into a panic, and the mutter jumped to her feet, to no reaction from the rabbit, and ran for safety. Less a water strider now than a freaked-out teenager in a horror movie. Halfway to the safety of the meadow, the mutter hit a hole disguised by mud, foot held long enough for her to scream as she twisted her ankle, falling heavy into the sucking mud, there to shout for help in between shrieks of pain. By the time team leader 2 heard her, she was trapped up to her knee, the other leg flashing white against mud riddled through with crab holes like rough pores. By the time they pulled the mutter to solid ground, to the waiting medic, Team Leader 1 noted all of her sample vials had been broken, costing us a day of work. The rabbit just sat there unfazed, Team Leader 2 noted, its teeth busy with the job of rendering down one carapace after another to the flesh beneath, while the eye stalks of the crabs, for as long as they were able, watched their own death with only mild interest. Old Jim read over the transcript of the mutter's conversation with the medic more than once. It felt wrong to him, or maybe the word was estranged from what had happened, or perhaps this was how you talked about something in the aftermath, something peculiar, unsettling. Mutter, he has a camera. Medic, who has a camera? Mutter, the rabbit. Medic, is there something in the corner of your eye that you cannot get out? Mutter, just a fleck of mud, just a speck. Medic, I have some pills that will calm you down. Mutter, I don't need pills. The rabbit had a camera on a strap around his neck. Medic, did he also have a pocket watch? Was he late for an appointment? Mutter, I could smell an odor, damp or electric, and it seemed shabby, old, like a cat that stopped grooming. And then the eye was like a camera, but it was wearing a camera. Medic, your ankle will be fine. Mutter, it was eating fiddler crabs. Do rabbits eat meat? No, I know they don't. Medic, there's no risk in the reward. Mutter, my ankle will be fine, I'm sure of it. Medic, your ankle will be fine, I'm sure of it. Team Leader 2 chose to believe the mutter, that something, perhaps a camera, had been around the white rabbit's neck, although it could have been just an ornate collar, as if the lagomorph had been a pet. No evidence other than the evidence of the mutter's close observation supported the claim of a camera, for when they had looked out over the marsh in the aftermath of rescue, the rabbit that had been so very visible and so very still was gone, as if it had never been there.
Awesome, thank you for doing that. All right, audience Q&A time.
Questions, concerns, issues, but the concerns and issues also have to be in the form of a question. And if you don't have any questions, I'll sing White Christmas, which I do quite badly.
For the Southern Reach trilogy, book 1 and 3 very much take place in Area X, whereas number 2 never actually enters it, mostly. What made you decide to kind of get away from Area X for book 2?
The question is why Authority, the second book in the series, never goes into Area X, but is in fact set in the bowels of the Southern Reach, the rather bureaucratic organization that's investigating Area X. I think basically I always saw it as another expedition into Area X. It's just simply through the psychology of 30 years of failure in dealing with it, and the mirrors and reflections that occur, and the assumptions about the area that are kind of like created in that situation. And I had worked in a lot of suspect state agencies and federal bureaus as a contractor, and I was kind of struck by the logic of their illogic, and the way I could see $1 million spent because some dude didn't get his coffee that morning in a particular way. And there was a lot of money being spent, a lot of decisions being made that had nothing to do with best practices. They were kind of ritualistic. And I thought that was interesting. And the idea with the Southern Reach was always to look at it from different perspectives. So even acceptance is not really looking at it just from Area X. There's a whole bunch of stuff in acceptance that is set back in the Southern Reach and on the other side of the border. Authority is also supposed to be a darkly funny book. It's much funnier if you've actually experienced that kind of bureaucracy and have had enough perspective, time plus tragedy equals comedy, to appreciate it. So a lot of the things that happen in the book, like a guy asking the main character, do you want to see a strange room, happened to me. Like on the first day on a job, some guy with this long ass beard wearing a ragged t-shirt poked his head around the corner. It was like, Jeff, I had never seen him before. Do you want to see a strange room? And do you know what I said? No. No, I don't. I don't know you. I might on my last day on the job with a witness. I might accompany you somewhere, sir, but not right now. The desk I inherited of that same job had a dead mouse and a living plant in one of the drawers. Yeah, there were a lot of things there that were true to life. And I felt very much vindicated on that book when someone really senior in the EPA came to the reading I did in DC, and afterwards took me aside and said she thought it was the funniest book she'd ever read, and then unfortunately it was very, very on the nose. So.
With your books, I assume there's a process of like the pre-writing where you're getting information. I was wondering if, one, you do that, and if you do, is that more distinct from your writing phase, or do you feel like you're always kind of looking for things while you're writing a novel?
Do you mean research, or do you mean?
Research, inspiration.
Research and inspiration, and I guess when that takes place, is that part of the writing process itself, or is it a preliminary step? In terms of formal research, I tend to take a long time to write novels and think about them for a long time, so I can kind of preload my brain with what I need years before I actually write a thing. So for Finch, this kind of noir fantasy, I actually took a job with Publishers Weekly, this was many years ago, just reviewing mysteries for them and noir, and this was like several years before I was going to write it, so even though I already read that stuff, I had to review and read a lot of stuff I wouldn't have encountered otherwise. And so by the time I wrote that book, I was so steeped in that stuff, I didn't need to think about the tropes or anything else. And in general, when I'm doing research, I try to do it years before. Whatever sticks with me is what goes in the book. I don't try to go back, because I've had that experience, as I'm sure some of you have, where the novelist becomes very invested in the time that they took to research something, so they're sure that you want to hear all of it. And I don't. I just want the stuff that's infused in the character and the emotional resonance and makes sense for the plot. So that's one answer. And then basically I think about novels for a long time. I've learned that I can write something too soon. For me personally, it's different for other writers. I can never write something too late. When I write something too late, I usually don't have to draft that much. And since I'm intrinsically lazy, that's great. If I can just walk around thinking about a book and then produce one, preferably in a couple days, that'd be amazing. But seriously, so hiking, walking is extremely important to me. Though I early on learned which kinds of leaves you can write notes on and which you can't if you want to have paper. Having had a whole series of ideas turned to basically dust in my pocket on one hike. So that happens, and I accumulate it. I try to accumulate it on note cards so I can sequence them properly. At a certain point, that hits critical mass, and then I'll type up a document with scene fragments that basically encompass the entire novel. And what I've learned is that when I hit about 33,000 words of that is when I'm ready to write. So when I start to write, I already have
little bits that I've gleaned from the world, from bits of conversation I've heard, observations of people already in this document. And then a lot of it gets used across it. And then for the natural world especially, you know, everything, for example, in the southern reaches of the natural world is something I have experienced firsthand, not including the really uncanny bits. But even the dolphin with a human eye. I have seen a dolphin come up into a freshwater canal at high tide to feed and then go back. When you first see that line of fin, your brain doesn't want to believe it's a dolphin. Your brain defaults to fish, to otter, to anything but that. And so that becomes a deeply uncanny moment because of the cognitive dissonance that your own brain is providing to you. And so that creates an uncanny moment in the novel. And the difference is there to create that. I have to put a human eyeball in that dolphin. But that's kind of how that works.
Yes.
What do you do when you're stuck? Like, when you can't write?
What do you do when you're stuck and you can't write? I think that it's really useful, if possible, to never get to that point. And I know that sounds like a very facile answer, but here's why I think it can work. From a very early age, I tried to reward my subconscious by writing down every idea I ever had. That meant if I woke up in the morning, I had a pad of paper and I wrote down, no matter how ridiculous it was. Like one day I wrote something down, I looked at it later. It was an idea for a novel about space armadillos invading someone's backyard and blowing up his house. I never did that. Never used that idea. But my subconscious was really happy that I at least wrote it down. So over time, when you do that, when you kind of reward your imagination, I think your subconscious rewards you. And what it does is it gives you too many ideas. And so you kind of have to winnow them down. So the answer for me, and it's different for everyone, is if I get stuck on one thing, I have something else I can work on. And sometimes it's not good to force it. There's a reason. You know, you have to think about something more. You might not have the skills yet. You might not have the perspective. You know, there's a novel, Born, that I talked about. I couldn't write that. Like, I started to write it, and I was like, oh no, I can't write about the mother-child relationship. I don't know enough about that. I don't have enough experience as a parent. I literally had to have more experience as a parent before I could write that book. So sometimes your brain is telling you something when it doesn't want you to write something. But having something else to write, you know, or using surrealist writing techniques or exercises like automatic writing right in the morning might generate something. So never get stuck on one idea if you can. And I know that might sound simple, but I think it's something you can train your brain to do over time.
You talked about how you didn't think that like literature should be used like as like a blueprint for society. But then like where do you think like it's okay to use it as a call to action, and like where does that go too far, if that makes sense?
Well, I mean, first of all, for a novel to be a call to action, it has to become something that's culturally or pop culturally ubiquitous. Otherwise, it's not a universal language for the people you're talking to. I think in that case, it's kind of useful. Like, I think someone like Octavia Butler might have reached that level or whatever. There's certain things, sometimes it's because of other media doing them, like movies, and so it's a shorthand. I don't think there's any problem with using it for a call to action. You know, I don't want to use a specific example, but there's a specific novel right now that's being used as a blueprint. And it's already outdated because it includes things like cryptocurrency as like a solution. And like a few years ago, people were nodding at this novel like, oh yeah, that makes a lot of sense, you know. So that's you know, there's actually a current, I'll go this far, I'll say there's a current affairs article about this novel that analyzes it for those things and shows you just why it wouldn't ever work. But calls to action are a different thing, right? They're about getting people emotionally involved in something. They're not about necessarily setting the policy. And I'm also not like, you know, just because I said that doesn't mean that it's true across all things. It's just something that I tend to generally think.
I was curious about your decision for Annihilation to write from the perspective of a woman and to put together a whole group of women to go on that trip. What was that like for you? Why did you make that decision?
Did y'all hear that question? The question is, why is it all women on the expedition, and why is it from the perspective of a woman? I'll just take you through my writing process in this case. I had dental surgery and had all my wisdom teeth removed and a root canal at the same time. I was on Oxycontin, but it wasn't really doing anything for me except making me itchy. I was in kind of an altered state. And I had this weird dream about a tower tunnel and something writing living words on a wall. I woke up, wrote all the words down, which is weird because I've never seen words in a dream before. Then in the morning, I woke up and I had the first 10 pages, and it was just a nameless narrator defined by their function, biologist, and there were 3 other members, an anthropologist, a surveyor, and, oh my God, a psychologist. And I'm like, oh, well, that's really interesting. I have no idea what I've just written. Let me sleep on it because I have to sleep anyway because I'm in a lot of pain. And you know, one thing I did think of that day is like, you know, who are they? Am I going to name them? You know, are they men, women? What can you know? And then I started thinking about all the movies I hate where there's like one woman scientist and she's dressed very differently than the rest of the expedition, and all that kind of stuff. You know, all the cliches and the kind of terrible stereotypes. And I thought it would be kind of interesting if they were all women, but I don't know if they are. And then I slept on it, and when I woke up in the morning, I had all their characters in my head, all their backstory, and they were all women. So that's how it happened, kind of organically. And, you know, once I knew that, it was like, am I going to name them? And that was interesting, because every time I tried to name them, it felt wrong, and I knew less about them. So I was like, okay, that's interesting. And then I was like, what's the number one thing that male authors do wrong all the time when they describe women or they name women or whatever else? And I'm like, oh, actually it's interesting if there's no physical descriptions and there's no names and all you do is judge them by what they say and do. And not only is that interesting, but it means the landscape will actually physically impinge more upon them, creating this claustrophobic effect I want, because there's literally less description of them to push back against the nature descriptions in the novel. And then I was like even more excited by the fact, oh, I won't reveal their ethnicities until book 2, which means that everyone will have a mental image in their heads that will be shattered, potentially, at the beginning of book 2. And that'll be a really interesting effect because I want book 2 to be even more disorienting. It also kind of tells a reader like what their defaults are, and maybe that's not a great thing. So that was kind of the process. But more generally, it's always about creating an individual character. You know, if the biologist hadn't cohered as an individual person with all these very specific things, just specific to them, that were of interest to me, it wouldn't have happened that way.
Got time for probably a couple more questions out there.
Yes.
You talked a bit about how observation, your hiking, has influenced your writing, and also about kind of fact and the difference between fact and extrapolation. I'm wondering about how you see the relationship between kind of your observation from the real world and weirdness and uncanny. Like, what does weird do for you? Why weird?
There's something about distance. I first observed it in writing Finch because I wanted to write about the Iraq War and that whole situation, but I felt completely incompetent to do so. I didn't also want to write from an American point of view in that, and I also didn't want to suborn or take away, kind of like write from an Iraqi point of view. There were plenty of Iraqi novelists doing that already. So writing a similar situation into a fantastical city and kind of reworking everything gave me the distance to write it, and I realized, oh, that's the same thing as like someone writing an autobiographical novel, and they have to have the distance from the stuff in their life to write about it. Similarly, in The Southern Reach, something about not ever naming the place they're in, and something about the way that it kind of becomes surreal and uncanny gives me the distance to write about things that otherwise I might not have been able to find the right vantage point to do properly. Because I really do want to write about things that are relevant, but I don't want to be topical, because I hate novels that mention things such that, or bring in elements such that they're kind of dated within 4 or 5 years. I just don't like reading that kind of thing. So I don't know if that makes any sense or answers your question, but that's kind of what it does for me.
Yes.
You mentioned how the character's environment impinge on their character as something you had to think about. How does your home state, or the state where you live, impinge on who you are?
Well, currently I'm living in Portland, and I got to say that I didn't realize the low-level stress impinging on me every day until I moved to a blue state. And so there's something about that. There's like a whir or a hum in the back of your head, you know, that's a stressor that you don't realize.
I also feel like I wrote a lot about Florida because it's so misunderstood. You know, there's memes like Florida man, which are vastly unfair. I mean, if there was an Oklahoma man meme or hashtag, I can guarantee you it would just be as horrifying as the Florida one. No offense to any Oklahomans in the audience, but you know, so in some ways, I write about Florida and the landscape because people don't realize that like North Florida is so different from your idea of what Florida is, and that there are so many biodiverse, amazing places in Florida. But it is a bunch of contradictions at this point. It is a terrible situation. And it's kind of hard to reconcile and hard to write about. That's why I think I turned to nonfiction for it, to do actual reporting. I'm really proud of the fact that I actually broke policy news and environmental news in like the Time article about like what a con the wildlife corridor was, giving money to wealthy landowners to basically still put crops on their land and do nothing except not turn it into condos, things like that. So sometimes fiction is not adequate as a response to certain landscapes and certain situations.
You spoke about like power of dreams or power of subconscious for you. Can you speak a little more to that and why that is of so much value to you as a writer, as an artist?
Yeah, it's tough. It's like I believe in doing the things mechanically that you can mechanically do. So, for example, as a young writer, I was aware I used too many adjectives, so I would mechanically go through and cut like a third of them. And there are other things you can do like that. And there's other things that need to be completely organic, or are about muscle memory, where you learn technique and then you forget you ever learned it. And then you let your mind, in kind of a state where it's not completely awake, so to speak, do the work of creating the spark or the charged image that really speaks, you think maybe to the reader, but also to you in writing something. So often what I'm getting from dream is some kind of image that has an inherent thematic or other symbolism that then my conscious brain turns into story. I think that's really important because I think that's something that for me is innate. Like it's something that just comes to me. For another writer, it's something else. So sometimes when I talk about the subject, I feel like it's probably meaningless to some writers because it's just not how their minds work. And they get to story in an equally interesting way, but just not through that. But you know, it's hard to explain. But when you wake from something like that, it's, you know, and sometimes it's while you're hiking. At least for me, it is literally like receiving an ecstatic vision, and it's very difficult to like quantify or to talk about because you know it's not. It is organic. It just is a thing that happens, and you can't really teach it. You know, it's just something that some writers have. It's not inherently superior to any other way of doing it. It's just the way it occurs to me.
All right, I think I saw two more hands, so we'll no pressure at all, but we want to land on fantastic questions here. So we'll go, Lisa.
Yeah, no pressure for the answers.
Right at the last one.
So I don't know if she read this somewhere or made it up, but my niece described you to me as if Aldo Leopold and David Lynch had a baby. my first question was, where's the mom? But in a lot
Not
of
Rachel Carson and Salvador Dali? No, I don't think Rachel Carson would have had anything to do with Salvador Dali.
You should be so lucky, right? A lot of your talk has been about the weirdness of nature and the nature of weirdness, right? If these are two DNA strands in you, how do you see them? Do you see them in tension or in balance, or does one? Whose side are you on? Are mom and dad fighting? I don't know.
There's no real side. I mean, I think it's just that the way we have separated nature and culture to such an extreme means that it's difficult, depending on how you're brought up, to see the thing. And the thing that was key to me was not any particular teaching, but just simply that I happened to always live in an incredibly biodiverse place where I always felt entangled with the landscape anyway. So it doesn't feel weird to me, when I write this stuff. I remember an early short story that I wrote because I started out as a poet, and I handed it to someone. I thought it was a totally realistic story. I still do. But to them, it was like weird Kafka stuff. So it just depends. Like, people who know North Florida, they find Annihilation incredibly comforting because they remember with fondness just how dense the biosphere is there, and how everything is not weird, but just like connected, and the rate of decay and the rate of, to give you an example, people don't believe me. At St. Mark's Wildlife Refuge, during the time when juvenile fish are appearing, there is no water. There are so many young fish. There is no water. The birds are simply standing there picking fish out of the water. They don't have to do anything. I don't know how to describe it. So when you see something like that, is that weird? Should that be normal? It makes me think of the propaganda the world gives us, like a movie like The New World, which, by Malick, is useful in some ways, but he cannot produce the fecundity of the world at that time. He can only produce the relative emptiness of the world we have now. Because if you look at accounts from that time, the sky would have been darkened with flocks of birds. The woods would have been so full it would seem Disney comical. So what is weird? I don't know.
That was pretty amazing. So
No pressure on either of us.
Double pressure.
You're not a ringer either. I just want to make sure you know.
I had a similar question as the one asked a couple of questions ago, dealing with consciousness. It's been on my mind a lot lately of the nature of ideas and how they come into existence, and then how they're created and how they affect the world after that. And I was just curious of how much you felt like you're building stories from scratch, and if there are times where you feel like you're more channeling these ideas, and the nature of where ideas come from, or consciousness.
I don't know if this answers your question about where ideas come from in consciousness, but I sometimes am very acutely aware that everything around us came from a good or a bad imagination. This stage, this rug, everything around us. It's not some inert decision. There were all these decisions that went into what you see, and that includes institutions, everything. Some bad or good imagination created that, collectively or individually. So often when I'm thinking about characters, I'm thinking, do they have a constructive imagination in how they see the world, what they create, or do they have a kind of a malfeasance there, or a thing lacking, that makes something less of the world? And so I find that really important in thinking about this question in terms of how I feel with regard to ideas. I feel like, just like, if I'm going to the gym, I have to support with what I'm actually putting in my body, and not drinking and things like that if I want to actually see results. The same thing, what are the inputs? What is it I'm reading? Am I reading To the Lighthouse along with something that, might be, like right now, like I read To the Lighthouse and I was watching Catfish, the TV show. So I'm not saying it has to be high culture. I'm just saying, like, you have to be aware of, like, these are the inputs that then put you in a space for whatever it is that the outputs are. But the outputs feel like something moving from beyond you, at least for me. So often when I'm writing a scene, I'm not even really aware I'm writing it. I am so in the interiority of the scene that I'm living it as I write it. And the challenge for me was learning, when revising, to enter that same place. So it was just as pleasing and pleasurable to me to do that, so I could radically change something that was broken. So for me, that's what it's like. It's like being taken over by something, and at a certain point, yeah, there's times when you're using your muscle memory to just power through it. But a lot of the times for me, there's this pure pleasure of living in the thing that I'm writing, to the point where I can't answer your question because I don't know how it works, if that makes any sense.
All right, fantastic. Well, a few comments to wrap up before we thank Jeff for this evening. I want to say thank you to Kendall Thompson for a flawless tech evening. Thanks to Jay, Robbie, and team for the live stream. We appreciate that. Thanks to everyone for coming out. Thanks to Asher Smith, the Assistant Director of the Keep, for really helping put all this together, too.
Yeah, thank you very much.
And right after we applaud and finish, there's a book sale and signing. So the Luther College Bookshop has copies of Annihilation and Absolution for sale. They're up in the front lobby. So we'll just take a quick water break, and then Jeff and I will be up there. He's happy to sign copies for you. And also Asher and I have some highly collectible event stickers that if you come up to us, we may be able to give you a sticker with a Pentacopterus sea scorpion drawn by my daughter Charlotte, who asked the question. And artistic design by Avery Rage. So, yeah. All right, and now, if you want to have a
I
final
just want to
comment,
say
and then we'll
thanks again to everyone, thanks to the college, and thanks especially to Andy for many kindnesses, so thank you.